Nobody trusts intelligence agencies, right? I mean, let's be honest. It's because we're like, we don't know what they're doing, and things come out 30, 40, 50 years after the fact. These modern intelligence agencies that grew up kind of after World War II and for decades just completely hid their activities, what they were doing, who they were doing them with. There's very, very low trust in intelligence agencies. So what do we want? Do we want them to be transparent? Do we want to know what they're doing? Do we want the sort of like doors open as much as possible? I think a lot of people would say yes. And interestingly enough, here in Canada, that is where our intelligence agencies are headed. So a couple weeks ago, our Signals Intelligence Agency in Canada, the Communication Security Establishment, CSE, released its annual report. And it happens to be its 80th anniversary this year. So this was like a big thing. We've been around for 80 years, and here's our annual report about all the stuff that we're doing. It's a good report. You can learn a lot from this report. But what is staggering about it is that if you would show that to anybody who worked in that agency in the 50s, 60s, I mean, up to the 90s, they'd be like, WTF? We're releasing this much information to the public? And the thing is you don't have to go back very far to see how much our intelligence agencies in Canada, at least, are changing in terms of the way they communicate with the public. So I started working at CSC 20 years ago this year, 2006. And I'm going to tell you 3 really quick stories about what it was like when I first started working there. Now, these agencies, signals intelligence agencies, post-World War II, their main function is foreign signals intelligence. But they also had this other smaller function, which is communication security, ComSec, which was essentially figuring out and providing keys, encryption keys, so the government could protect its information against the signals intelligence activities of other countries. Now, even when I started working there in 2006, that ComSec part, which had kind of grown into this IT security business line, was definitely the junior partner. I mean, you could tell. It was not only the vibe around the building, I mean, it was obvious in meetings. SIGINT was where all the cool kids were. IT security was that kind of annoying little geeky brother you had to bring everywhere and you ditched as soon as you could. The glamour was in SIGINT. That's where all of the attention went. Another thing that existed when I started working there was they had a small communications team. The head of communications at the time was a manager. In the government, that's a pretty low-level position. It's not even in the executive. It was a team of maybe six or 7 people. And the majority of those, let's say 5 out of 6, worked on internal communications. Things like, organizational-wide newsletters about what was happening and stuff like that. Stuff they would post on the intranet. There was one guy who dealt with external communications. He was in charge of media relations, but he was working level. He wasn't a supervisor. He wasn't a manager. One guy was in charge of media relations. And you know why it could be just one guy? Because his entire job was no comment, no comment, no comment. CSC didn't talk to the media. It just wasn't a thing. And this was only 20 years ago. Like, this was when I was working there. And the final thing I'm going to tell you about when I first started, which carried through, for a lot of years, was we get this sort of like late spring, we get this bulletin from Personnel Security, organization-wide. Everybody gets this. And Personnel Security is the part of the organization that, addresses the physical security of the people and the security clearances, making sure that, you pass all the security tests to get in. So they're about securing the people, okay? And they put out this memo being like, how to answer questions at summer barbecues. I kid you not. And one of the things they said, now, Personnel Security at the time was pretty much staffed by ex-CSIS intelligence officers who are kind of having a second career. Older guys who'd grown up, done a lot of operational activities during the Cold War. So this idea of being public and saying you worked at CSE was really difficult for them. So in this memo, they were like, you tell people that you work at Department of National Defense, which for CSE isn't technically a lie. It wasn't at the time, because CSE reports to the Minister of National Defense. They still do. So it's more like an obfuscation. And I remember at the time, there were a few people who were like, hey, wait a second, like, we need to push back against this because we work in IT security, that junior partner that nobody wants to talk about. But we go out, at least into the government, and say, hey, we work at CSE and we have some, cybersecurity information we want to share. It doesn't make any sense that we go out professionally and present ourselves as being from CSE. And then, at some summer barbecue, you're telling us to basically lie and say we work for D&D. And that, to me, I remember that being the beginning of this conversation that just started to snowball. And then I left, and here we are 20 years later, and I'm reading their annual report, and I can tell that that working environment that I was in has completely changed. When you read CSE's annual report this year, it is quite clear that there's a new attitude, and I don't want to say new like it happened yesterday, but over the last 20 years, a new attitude about the relationship CSE has with the public. So first of all, the media relations department, it's probably not one guy anymore. In the annual report, they make this, they share all the outreach activities that they're doing, and I'm not going to read them all, but there are a ton that hit directly with the general public. They do workshops with Media Smarts. They run national public awareness campaigns called Get Cyber Safe. They have a community outreach program. This is your signals intelligence agency in Canada, and they have a community outreach program. Now, the program is mostly focused on encouraging people to, study mathematics and engineering and presenting kind of cool cryptologic problems to inspire people to maybe work in this field. But still, they go out there as CSE. All of this stuff is branded at CSE. Even for me, you don't even have to go back to the 50s and 60s is what I'm saying. Even for someone like me, the difference is staggering. The other thing that's completely clear when you read that annual report is nobody's working in a vacuum anymore. So when I was there and I said, you had SIGINT and you had ITS, and they were two business lines. And, SIGINT didn't want to get together with ITS that often. It wasn't like we were all buddy-buddy, right? Now you can tell that that's completely changed, that the organization is not organized around those two business lines anymore. It's organized around the mandates, and they share information from one mandate to another in order to achieve their goals. They have operational examples in the report. So since I work there, CSE got its own act called the CSE Act. And in it, they have a brand new mandate. It's their fourth mandate. And it's for doing what you could call cyber effects or cyber operations, on the digital infrastructure, which could be things like taking down a terrorist recruiting site or something like that, right? So they can do that stuff now. They couldn't when I was there. But in order to do those kinds of operations, you don't just go out and do them, right? That's what intelligence is for. Intelligence has always been collected in order for somebody to take an action, whether it's a diplomat to have a trade conversation, or now, in this case, your Foreign Signals Intelligence Agency to go out and actually do takedowns on the digital infrastructure, and a whole variety of things in between. So you collect that intelligence. They collect it under their first mandate, which is signals intelligence, foreign signals intelligence, but they also collect information under their second mandate, which was it's to help provide advice, guidances, and services to help protect the systems of importance of the Government of Canada, Mandate B, but it's the cybersecurity mandate. It's the protection mandate, right? So they collect under these mandates, and then they go craft these operations. Now, they don't just use their own data. It says everywhere how much they're collaborating with partners. So to conduct an operation, they may work with CSIS. They may use some CSIS data. They will work with the Canadian Armed Forces, to do the actual deployments. Who knows? They don't have those kind of operational details in there. But my point is they're not doing any of this alone. And it's not just the usual suspects in terms of partners. And that's the other thing that's really, really staggering. So when I was there, it's like the Five Eyes. Now, it's always been the Five Eyes. I mean, that's like the biggest partnerships. And then, like usual CSIS, military, sometimes the RCMP. But now when you go into their annual report, the list of partners is provincial governments, territorial governments, critical infrastructure. And like I said, they're outreaching to the general public. They're partnering with academic institutions, industrial groups. There's so many actually partnerships. It's kind of overwhelming to read, right? Indigenous groups to help protect the Arctic. I mean, the list is like this. Now we have systems of importance to the government of Canada all the way over in Europe. We added Lithuania this year. So this idea that's being presented that is very clear from their annual report of our Signals Intelligence Agency in Canada is extremely different from how these agencies started. And of course, what a lot of the history says, a lot of the unclassified information, you only get it 20, 30, 40 years later when it becomes declassified. So it paints a picture of an organization that's, in the past. And you can compare that to the annual report and say, wow, things don't work that way anymore at all. Gone are the days when you could have like the Navy and the Army in the same military intercepting and decrypting and doing analysis on their own and not sharing with each other. Why are things changing? Well, one of the obvious reasons is the operational environment is changing. Intelligence operations are like anything else. You have to do them in the world as it is, not in the world that you want it to be. Right? And yes, I know people think the government, all this power and all this spooky stuff because it's this giant machine. And yes, there is some power. They have access to a lot of personal information about their citizens. But when you look at the amount of people working at CSE and you look at the reach they have, I mean, there's small potatoes compared to like Meta or Microsoft, right? They're tiny. And they have to go out and do these operations. And it's clear that over the decades, and I'm going to say especially the last 2 decades, what has become obvious is that they can't go it alone. Nobody can go it alone anymore. The digital infrastructure is far too big. So in order to execute their mission, which is protecting Canadians, protecting sovereignty, Canadian sovereignty, they got to work with people. They have to work with everybody. And all those other people, they're realizing it too. They all have to work together and they have to work with the general public. They have to take themselves out of the shadows and try to rebuild that trust. Now, that's not going to be easy. I've looked at some of the stuff they've put out in the comments on it, and there's a lot of mistrust to overcome there, but you got to start somewhere, right? So I want to hear from you. I'm really curious what people think of this. Like this changing nature, and let's just stick to Canada and Signals Intelligence Agency. Like we don't have to do all intelligence agencies, but what do you think? Do you trust our Signals Intelligence Agency, CSE? Have you ever heard of them? Are you curious to know more? Might you go read a bit of that annual report? Do you not trust them? What could they do to make you trust them? Because they're obviously trying, and it's a very massive change in the institutional thinking when you look at the historical context they came from. So let me know. I'm super curious. If you have any questions, obviously I'm always open to answering them, and I'll probably do another video about particulars in the report itself that are kind of interesting. But what really struck me is what I covered today, which is just how much these organizations are changing and how they're trying to find a place as they try to execute their mission in this increasingly complex, especially digital world. So anyway, hope everyone's having a good day otherwise.